I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, help me welcome Ted Rao. Ted is an extraordinarily articulate and well-versed spokesperson for one of the alternative methods of self-organizing and self-governing in groups, Sociocracy. He's the co-author of Many Voices, One Song, and has an extraordinary personal experience of both individual transformation and the transformation of groups. Please help me welcome Ted Rao. All right, welcome to another round of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And I'm just got through telling Ted what my agenda was, what my desire was for our conversation today. So my apologies for a little bit of a recap now again, as I do an absolutely bare minimum introduction of you, and I'm hoping that you will then take it and run and really fill in the gaps that I'm undoubtedly going to leave about you and my experience of you. So I had the remarkable opportunity to speak in a panel of folks for the Global Eco Village Network and their upcoming summit here in April of 2021. And so that is the plug right there, and there'll be ways to contact that summit in the show notes for this particular interview as well. But Ted, I was just so struck by each person on the panel. There was a level of articulation and clarity, and also just the kind of I don't want to use the word professionalism. I want to use the word like a like an innate competence that just seemed to exude out of each person when they took their turn to introduce themselves and make their points and so on. And you were no exception. And Ted Rao, your representation in that particular panel discussion was about sociocracy. So this has been a sideline interest of mine for decades, working with alternative organizations, particularly in the realm of community service groups. And they, by their nature, needed something other than the business as usual structures to be able to be successful at a smaller scale, and particularly with a different agenda than the business as usual structures are usually fed by. And that's what's caught my ear for years about hearing about sociocracy. And again, you were one of the clearest voices I've heard to date describing what is this thing. And so we all only had a few minutes, and I was quick to put out the invitation to all of us on the panel to speak in this podcast. And so that's about as much introduction I can give of you. So thank you so much for spending time with us. I look forward to when we flesh out this picture of what is sociocracy, why is it important to you, how does it show up as useful in your practices, in your work. And then we'll get to other questions as well toward the end. But would you start us out by, perhaps you could just start us out by whatever your experience might have been that you'd like to share about that panel discussion, but then please go right into filling us in on who you are and how do you fit sociocracy into your work. And thanks for being here.
Dean. So that panel, what I liked about the panel is actually it seemed almost like an eclectic group of people, but there was something that brought us all together, right? And that we all shared. And I think I enjoyed the level of shared reality there. And and also that we were all drawing very similar conclusions, because shared reality is great, but there was also a sense of shared purpose, I guess, in, okay, and let's do something, you know, like let's make something happen, because our diagnosis is or our interpretation of what's happening is very similar, and this is what is following from it, or what we draw from it, what needs to be done. So I enjoyed that. And sociocracy, right? Sociocracy is next. Sociocracy, in short, is a governance system. Most of us have been around governance systems because that's how people run themselves, right? Most of us have been around power over systems where the boss decides, or mom decides, the teacher decides, and that's the end of the story. And many of us have been part of, well, everybody has been part of informal groups where there's this kind of, that I would call informal consensus kind of thing happening, of we just talk and then something happens. And I think we're all on the same page, but we don't really know. That's how friends groups organize, right? That's also how many small nonprofits, for example, organize. And there's nothing completely wrong with that. You know, it's better than just having a top-down kind of structure, but it often lacks the clarity. And clarity is really our best friend when it comes to decision making, right? Because it's in those gaps and those misunderstandings that friction can happen, and then conflict arises. So clarity, we can have clarity without the power over aspect. And that's the best of both worlds that I think about. So it's super clear, super flexible as a governance system. And I'll explain in a moment how it works, just in a broad overview, while not having that power over aspect. So nobody can tell you what to do about the things that you do. That's really in your own purview. So it is a really smart combination of different tools, and that's what I love about it. It's like an alive tool that has all these different pieces to plug together and form something that feels very much whole. And it is a way to make decisions by consent. And that means a decision moves forward when nobody has an objection to it, nobody in the group that makes the decision. So that's very inclusive, because nobody can be just ignored, right? But at the same time, it's not that everybody has to be absolutely happy with the decision. It's like, no, good enough. We're settling for good enough. And then we put something into action and we do something. So it's very action oriented and still inclusive. It hits that sweet spot, while being very clear and explicit. That's another thing compared to these informal ways of decision making or voting, for example, that would then ignore the minority, right? The other thing that it does, it organizes people into small groups that are then connected, that we call linked and nested circles. And the advantage of that is that we're only dealing with small groups. So people 5, 6, 7 in a group, maybe 8, but that already pushes it. And the sweet thing about that is that seems to be like a human size for group. Like we can track the body language of 6 people in a room, right? We can have a sense of where they're at, what they're thinking, whether they're in or out. When we have 10, we can't really do that anymore. We can't really get to know each other as deeply. We can't really all be heard. And it's this fallacy that people tap into of, oh, if we have, let's say, a group of 50 people, and I want to be as inclusive as possible, let's just all get them in the same room and all talk. Yay, that's so egalitarian. Everybody is the same, right? But what really happens if you do that, if you invite 50 people to a 2-hour meeting, all that happens is that the same 5 people will talk. And those tend to be male, they tend to be educated, they tend to be middle class, you know, they tend to be white. It's all just the same again and again. Yeah, so, and so it is just not true that having everybody in a large group, everybody together and just talk what people say, just talk is not giving us what we really want. And
Can I just pause you for a second, Ted? Because you're moving beautifully, clearly through some of the basics. I appreciate that. I want you to keep going, and I just want to pause for a second on that that brief summary of the the criteria that are used to say, okay, we're done with this piece, let's move on to the next piece. And what I was hearing you say was it's not necessarily 100% alignment amongst every single person. There is some kind of a border that is crossed, or that is reached and then ideally crossed. And the piece that I heard you say that allows the group to cross over that border is, I'm sorry, these are my words, and I'd love it if you would correct me. It's like something along the lines of, this is good enough for me now. I can live with this. You can live with this. We've got a place where we're all nodding. Let's move on. You know, it's not perfect for me, but I can definitely live with this. Is that safe to say?
Yes, that's perfectly safe to say. And let me actually elaborate on this, because I think this is actually super important to me. So first of all, what does it mean not safe enough, right? What is under, like, what's below that threshold of what's not good enough? Well, something is not good enough if it doesn't allow you to do the piece that you sign up for. And that what we call the shared aim of, okay, you're joining a group because there's something that you're subscribing to, of like some shared plan of action. If you can't do your part in that, like if some plan is basically throwing a monkey wrench into what you were planning to do, that's not good enough, right? If somebody hijacks the meetings consistently, that's not good enough, right? Because you need to be able to do your work. So honoring functioning, operating functional groups that are moving things forward, that is one of the key pieces. On the other hand, what's good enough is anything that gives you something that works for everybody. That's one thing. And then, because some people interpret this consent decision making as watered down consensus. Oh, in sociocracy, you don't get what you want. You just have to settle for what's good enough. You know, that's kind of the view that people have on it. And that's something I don't share at all. Because what the difference is between I can work with this and I love it, that's the best idea ever, is just my opinion. It makes no difference to the plan, you know, whether it's workable or workable plus I love it, really is not that relevant. So what I love is the practice that my own opinion will be held a little bit more lightly. You know, like, okay, fine, I wanted something else. So, you know, so you're not taking yourself as that important anymore. But what you are taking more seriously is learning by doing. So instead of hypothesizing what would be the best plan or what you wanted and elaborating on all the opinion space, instead you're settling for good enough, so that you can try something out, so that you can all learn from reality instead of what's in your head. And that's the piece that excites me of, oh, let's all learn. And that puts you all in the same boat.
Mm-hmm. Is it safe to say, I'm just curious if a part of this process for this organization, this imaginary organization that's doing this, is there some sort of skill offered to be learned by the folks involved with the process of decoupling themselves, like that will help me learn to decouple my opinions and my identification with the cause, my particular things that I'm wanting to represent in this process. It seemed like what you were just talking about means that I've softened my grip, my kind of death grip that I can come in with. I want this, and you know, I won't take anything less, kind of a thing. If I have some way of having it be okay, but it's less than what I would have called perfect when I was walking in the door, that means I've decoupled from my identification with my opinions or my cause or whatever, to the degree that I can see a range that's acceptable, that's strong enough. Is that safe to say? And is that something that sociocracy or a facilitator like yourself can help people loosen their grip?
Yeah, and that's to me really like an almost like an ecosystem of different things that have to go together, right? I mean, sometimes we're in a bad place and we are that person that has the tight grip on something, right? So
Yeah.
that first disclaimer, we're all that person sometimes, right? None of us is perfect. And sometimes that happens because of other things that might not even be in the room, right? It might be it's like whatever it might be. But it is possible to, in some way, dilute the energy a little bit. For example, one thing that we do a lot is doing rounds. So instead of doing this, like I say an opinion and then the person across from me will say, ah, that doesn't work because, and then the other person interrupts me and then I interrupt that person, right? That's debate style. We call it debate style.
Right.
And that typically polarizes more, right? Because you're in the business of proving each other wrong.
Right.
While around completely changes the energy. If you talk one by one, you're actually going to listen to each other. And that's one, because you know you will have your space. And while somebody else is talking, you're not preparing a counter argument and sitting on the edge of the seat waiting to interrupt and jump in. But you're starting to lean back and have this like, oh, okay, let's see what we can do here.
Yeah.
So that's a huge game changer, these rounds. And then people don't hold on to their own opinions as tightly in the first place. That's one thing. The other piece is that we really put that shared purpose, that aim front and center. So you are united in that. That's what's getting you into the room, right? And the other pieces, and I think that's super key, and people always look at quite a bit. Everybody who is in a decision maker in a group is also co-worker on that very issue, because we put the decision-making power into the hands of the people who work in that domain.
Mm-hmm.
So, and often, to be honest, what happens is that we have strong opinions about what other people should do, right? Because we don't even have the context, and that's great for our projections, right? But here we have the context. Like, this is about me and my colleague, my 3 colleagues that are organizing the same thing with me, deciding what's best. We don't get as caught up in our ideological battle, because ultimately we know we want the same thing. We want to make this thing happen.
Yeah.
So that changes everything to me.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I'm I want to ask this question, but with the caveat that please keep going in the direction that you're going in. So don't let me take you off track if this question takes you off track. And that is, I follow a number of activist organizations that for me are distinct in the past few years. There are some strong ass organizations showing up, real different than say 10, 20 years ago. And most of the mainstream service or activist organizations, um, there's an awful lot of business as usual that is just as saturated in those organizations as any corporation might be. But in these past few years, there have been a few real exceptions, like cracked open whole new possibilities. One of them that comes to mind is Extinction Rebellion. I've been really watching closely because they're very transparent and public with their process. So they'll have a video of their executive team meeting. It's just wide open, and here I am, warts and all. Here we go. And I find those extraordinarily valuable. And one piece of XR's work is to suggest and possibly set up citizens' assemblies. And that's the first organization that comes to mind for me, is that citizens' assembly notion seems like it would be a perfect fit for the kinds of facilitation and dynamic that you're talking about. So if you'd like to say anything about that or include that in the thread that you're on, please do. And if not, we'll pick it up later. So please take it where you need to go.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to take that. I mean, what is ever a tangent, right? It's all somewhere in the mix. Yeah, I'm very closely familiar with Extinction Rebellion. I'm actually a member myself, and part of the SOS working group in New York City. So SOS, for those who don't know, is a self-organizing system. It's a system very, very similar to sociocracy that's being used. Actually, in New York City, we're basically using sociocracy's tools. We're just using the words or the jargon that is typically used in SOS, like external coordinator and so on. Yeah, I guess the power of all of that is that there's something to be said about learning how to collaborate, but that's actually, I already wrote down a few notes to what you had mentioned you would like to ask in the second part, and that's maybe we should just go there.
Yeah, sure.
Because
Go for it.
that's where I want to go with this, I guess, because what is exciting about extinction rebellion to me is both super exciting for the reasons that you've talked about. It's also very daunting for a number of reasons. And I think one thing that comes up for me that I find a little scary for our outlook in general, as in we, the human species, is the fact, I'm going to put out a daring hypothesis, okay? My daring hypothesis is sociocracy as a system and the related systems, SOS, holacracy, and so on, all along the same lines. They are actually better or better suited for the time that we're in than us as individuals. Because now what I notice in organizations is that the weak link, so to speak, and that sounds a little harsh, but it's what I observe. The weak link is the people. The system is not holding them back anymore. Now it's the people that are struggling, and because they get caught up in their own stories, they get caught up in their own personal development and their limiting beliefs and their biases and so on. The system, in my view, sociocracy has made that quantum leap to giving human beings the full freedom and full empowerment to collaborate together. And now people still have to catch up. So often in our meetings here, that's sometimes something we say, like, oh, we have it all down, like we now understand how to do it, but what about the people? That's a little bit the slogan. But what about the people? What are we going to do with its people? How can we get people to a level so they're ready to really take the whole thing? It's a little bit like having I don't know, I don't want to use a machine as a comparison, but some kind of, the metaphor that comes up for me is just something that you bought that you're not even using. It's like using a computer as a typewriter,
Yeah.
Just like we're underusing the system, and that's not only sad but also a little scary, because I wonder how we could get ready.
So, Ted, totally clear this example of, let's just say, our smartphones, which is in almost everybody's hands now, and there's more computing power in there than the world has ever seen up until less than a generation ago. It's just like mind blowing, and none of us is using that, our smartphones, to the level of its capabilities. Not even close. It's just it's this extraordinary distance between the two. I'm curious if you could give us just an example or two at the extraordinarily human level, phones aside. Um, how is the sociocracy, holacracy, these methodologies? They sound like they're damn good. Like what you're saying is these things have been worked out, and this is some technology that is very, very functional. And yet you're saying, and so we get a room full of people, and we have to catch them up. We have to actually do something to bring them up to a level together where they can really use the methodology for what it's worth, because all they've known is far less than that. So can any examples of what you're seeing that makes you say that?
Yeah. So there's so many, and they all look innocent, but I see them as a bigger part of a pattern, and that's the daunting piece. So for example, so I'm in a leadership position. I'm technically the operational leader of the general circle of the organization, Sociocracy for All, that I co-founded. So I'm also at the same time just a circle member in several circles. I was thinking about that yesterday. It's actually quite cute. There's a person in my organization who's also on staff, and we're in several circles together. In some of them, I am a leader, and he is like one of the normal circle members, non-leader circle members. And in some circles, it's the other way around. So we both get to basically submit to leadership and also lead the other. And that that tickles my, I just find it very pleasurable as a like shifting modes a little bit of like, whatever you say, that's fine. Like, I'm just following your lead here. That's great. I not that I just, just submit and obey. That's not the point, but letting other people lead and having that, I want to say, softness to just let that happen. Is something that then, in contrast, what we see quite a bit is people asking, what should I do? People saying, oh, but this can't be done, Or for example, a very, very subtle example is the following. I see that in meeting facilitation all the time. And that is that people get bogged down by chicken egg situations of like, oh, but we can't decide this yet because we don't know what's going to happen 3 steps down the road. So what are we going to do about that? And then they talk about that. It's like, no, make the next step, then review it, like go into iterative steps, like go forward, don't get caught up in, like they get overwhelmed. And then they're just like, oh my God, I don't know what to do now. And just teaching people of like how to do, that's not even a Sociocratic thing. This is just the life skill of how do you build incrementally, how do you build iteratively, all of those things. And one of them, actually, let me put a little plug in here because it's one of my favorite topics right now. Actually, so favorite that I wrote a little booklet about it that just came out. Because people get caught up in the following thing. They want to start a group, like a little organization, all is great. And then they tell me things like, oh, and we don't need a governance system yet because we're going to wait till we have more people. But then they have more people, and then they have been operating without a governance system, and then they don't know how to retroactively introduce one because who's deciding what that governance system is without any governance system? That's why I call the book Who Decides, because that's what it goes down to. But this booklet, and which is basically a template of, okay, here's how you start, and then you do this, and then you do that. Like the first 3 meetings to just set the foundation to even do anything. That requires for people to follow a format, and people don't see, I guess I want to, in my world, and that might sound more judgmental than it maybe is. Maybe I am actually a little bit judgmental there. Just gonna own it. It is that people don't choose to submit to a template. They rebel because that's what we've learned, right? Because we all were born into a power over culture. So we rebel or we submit and we do all these crappy things instead of saying, yes, I'm choosing this because I think it will be good for us and the thing we want to do together. So those are examples of where people get tripped up, not by the system, but by what's in their own head. And then that holds them back because the system is all very easy. You just have to do the things in some order and then review it. Or for example, just the level of clarity that is needed, choosing the right level of clarity of, do we understand this enough right now? Or do we need more clarity? And people don't ask themselves that. They just do things and then they complain that it didn't work.
Right on. So do you know if XR is, do you know how they're putting together what they're calling citizens assemblies? Because it's got to include some structure like sociocracy. It's also got to have some core commitment to a way of getting those randomly chosen representatives up to speed with whatever it is that they're supposedly choosing. They've got to be able to do a whole different level than most people have of critical thinking. And they've also got to have a deep competency in almost no time at all in terms of knowing what they're talking about and what they're choosing. So I think there were 3 or 4 questions in there, and really my most important one is just have you seen sociocracy included in this kind of formulation? And if not, that's not a problem. I'm just curious because you seem to have enough experience that almost at any turn here, you've been able to point out a number of core distinctions, what seems to work, what seems to not, what seem to be the trends when you get a new group of people together, and what tend to be the default uh, potholes that they'll fall into because all we've ever known in this group is business as usual, the usual way of communicating, the usual way of trying to sabotage leadership, the usual way of just being rebellious. If I don't know what else to do, I just be rebellious just because in the space. So I know I've asked too many questions in that. Let me just stop for a moment and see what's most important there. I guess anything more you would say, perhaps this goes to that second part of the interview that you were wanting to get to. Maybe I could ask you how does this work really warm your heart, really inspire you as a possibility for people to do something that truly matters in their lives, in their communities? What got you, hooked you enough about this kind of work that you decided to dive in full out? How about that? How if we just make that the question? Because I think that's where I was kind of wanting to head.
Mhm, mhm. Uh, here's something. I guess on a very personal level, what hooked me was the promise that we could have forward motion while still being deeply connected. And I hadn't experienced that yet. I had only experienced that groups either turn dysfunctional in all the different ways that we all know, or that some people become leaders, which was often me. And being a leader seemed to mean to be put into a separate category, which I experienced as very disconnecting. I struggled with my sense of belonging in that, of like, hold on. So that means now I'm not part of the pack anymore because now I'm a leader, just that kind of taste of things. And I just found that heartbreaking, actually heartbreaking enough that I tended to avoid organizations for quite a while because it's so disorienting to not like to, it's this push and pull of, I want to be part of this, but as soon as I throw myself in, I'm being made a leader and then I'm not in anymore. So, but I can't also be half in because then we're not really present. And I don't know, it sounds almost ridiculous at saying it that way, but it really threw me off. It was like a mismatch that I couldn't solve. And then I moved into this co-housing community here in Massachusetts. And we were operating sociocratically, which I didn't tell me, like I didn't know anything about it, but I noticed in these meetings, hold on, you can actually have both here. It feels deeply connected and we're still committed to forward motion. And that combination totally hits it off for me of like that. Yeah. It's because I care about people, but I also equally care about forward motion, and getting both at once, mutually enhancing each other, right? Because it's in the forward motion that we enjoy that companionship, really on a deeper connection. So that got me. And that's also keeping me because I absolutely love the work that I'm doing, and I absolutely love the people I'm doing it with. So yeah, it's just fantastic.
All right. I guess I'm going to.
sorry, I'm just going to add, and then what drives me is thinking about all the billions at this point, people that don't have that, that have to check their brain, or like, you know, the, as in Thiel organization, they say, you know, the whole person, they have to check out, because that's just not going to be wanted. And that's, yeah, it was very transformative for me, especially in the early years, to even get used to this kind of system. All kinds of things happened for me in my personal life, just out of implications, out of what I had experienced, of like, hold on, you can actually be yourself and be a productive member of a group. Blew my mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, at the very beginning, in fact, before we turn on the record button for this talk, I was letting you know the last couple of questions that I often ask, and I'm more curious now than before. I'm curious if you could just share with us on a really a very, very personal level, as personal as you're willing to be. You know, we're living in times, like, in my judgment, it's a time different than any other in human history in so many ways. And there are elements on a global scale that human beings have never had to grapple with on that scale, and that infuses down into every level of life, in, again, in my judgment about it. And that means that there are some concerns. There's some things that it just to be present in the kind of work that I do, not too dissimilar from your own. There's some days when I'm about pushed to my capacity to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors at whatever scale I'm attending to. I'm curious if you have your own set of the elements that you look out and you see them present in the world, and it's heavy on your heart, a little harder than most things to just move through your system and kind of be with, uh, things that are a significant concern for you when you look out there.
Earlier, before we turned the recording on, when you introduced yourself a little bit more deeply to me, I was thinking about the following thing that's very present for me right this, like, in these weeks, because of the pandemic situation and my kids. I have 5 children. The youngest is almost 8, the oldest is 17. The teenagers have been struggling big time during this pandemic. And what strikes me in particular is they're angry. They're angry with all the older generations. And the reason they're angry is because they feel completely like betrayed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, you know, this, what they would mention is like racism, sexism, you know, like inequality, climate change. Like, they're just like, sure, what else are you gonna pile on top of that, you know? Because this is pretty screwed up. Like, this can't be, like, you mean that? This is ridiculous, you know? So, and I completely, you know, of course, I completely agree. And now what has happened, I might be complete, I hope I'm wrong on this, but so in their view, and my children are wonderful, considerate human beings, but there is a part of them which I can join that has the following train of thought. They say, like, hold on, this whole COVID thing is a virus that wouldn't have harmed them. So, you know, speaking as them in first person, they say, so this wouldn't have harmed me. So you're telling us we have to stay home from everything we love, and that's important to us right now, to protect you guys. And now you guys are vaccinated and we're not. You know, like, what? Like, what? How is that fair? So for them, that's just another piece of the puzzle of
Mhm.
having, yeah, just, it seems so inconsiderate. And once you put yourself in their shoes, it makes perfect sense.
Mhm.
They get the shorter end of the stick every single time. And I think that they're either gonna be, I don't know, turning things around, or they're just gonna be very, very angry. And I can see it both going, no, I mean, or both at the same time, I guess.
Sure.
Um, but that anger is scaring me a little bit, because I don't think they're going to forget about this even in 10 years. This is going to stay around. So that's just one of the things, in all of the like growing complexity and things that we can't oversee anymore. That's a new piece that has been introduced into the
Mhm.
game for me, that I'm tracking mentally a little bit, and just wondering of like, oh, what are these kids going to be like when they're in their late 20s, and what's going to happen with that? And I don't know. So that's I'm just worried that we're all a little oblivious towards that, the older generations, and we'll have to reckon with it.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you. I just um, I like to ask that question just so those who watch these conversations on a regular basis can get a sense of how is it for other folks, whether it's from, I speak with a lot of folks from the UK and Europe, or from Australia, or from South Africa, or from other parts of the USA, and so on. And so it's important to just hear from each other of what matters most in this moment from our individual little lives and frames. On the other side of that coin of that question is, I'm curious, given you have quite an ability to see the current state of affairs of, say, a local organization or a national organization, you can start to, it seems like that you have an ability to sniff out, if you will, when an organization is running well. They seem to be having an open or a successful or a positive uh, motion in terms of how they organize, how they self-organize, how they express into the world, how they handle conflict within, and so on. I'm curious if you could share anything, any organization, really anything from your perception in the world that consistently inspires you, consistently helps you keep your heart open in the face of stressors that are going on.
I don't think I want to point out like a particular organization. I think what impresses me the most always is when an organization is self-healing or self-repairing, right? When an organization, no matter what, somehow figures it out. That
Mhm.
I find really impressive. The Yeah, a commitment to learning and growth, and that together with a level of vulnerability that makes it connecting and real. So those are the things that I'm drawn to. Um, yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Okay. I'm inspired to mention an example of that also really works for me ongoingly since more than a year now. There's been some challenges for the UK Extinction Rebellion folks, and particularly I'm thinking that Roger Hallam had a massive upset around just one of his interviews around his inclusion of comments about comparisons of the Holocaust to what we're facing now. And I don't want to get into all the details of who misunderstood what or what was misspoken and so on. There's plenty of that. But what I've noticed, and I don't think I'd have mentioned it until you said what you said, that uh, there have been problems. There have been upsets. There have been rifts in Extinction Rebellion between different uh, continents and parts of the organization. But it really keeps coming back to, it seems like they're working it out. Like you were just saying, this is a tough one. And it seems like they're staying related and they're staying connected and they're working the hard stuff in this conversation. Doesn't get much harder than that in terms of, having a fire show up in the middle of the conversation and so on. So I appreciate you mentioning that. And it feels good to just acknowledge that, because I also have a real honoring of how difficult it is to create an alternative to the controlled power narrative that's going on around the globe, and has such a tight grip on us all, has saturated us all. And to try and create any alternatives to that at any level, it takes courage. It takes amazing strength. And so I really appreciate what you were saying about being inspired by that return to relationship, even in the tough moments.
And to add to that, I want to say we're doing an organization like Extinction Rebellion, or any of us, we're doing double duty.
Mhm.
We are reinventing what things could be like while dealing with the trauma of what we have been through, right? So all our rebellion, submission, all of our trauma related to power, and there's so much, right? Related to oppression and all of that, that is not gone, right? So we're doing two things at the same time. So that's something I appreciate so much about Extinction Rebellion, is the focus on regenerative work, of just regen in all the different ways, because one can only do it together, right? You can't just declare the problem solved and say, from now on, we're going to start and do everything right. That's not how it's going to go. So both at the same time.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
it is. It is. Something that really keeps my heart open is to see people willing to step back closer to one another, even when everything in their system is saying, "Get out of here, run away." Pedro, it's just been a pleasure to speak with you. I knew it would be. I think it it would be ideal for me if we could make a regular deal of this, where we could get back together and just keep touching in about, how our bodies of work are going, how we're seeing the world, kind of an update of our perspectives and our experience. I would very much appreciate it. I'm so I learned so much from your ability to articulate your work, and what inspires you and what concerns you. So I'm going to bug you. I'm going to bug you, and it might be 6 months, might be a year, but I would very much like to touch back in and see how we're both doing and how the world is doing through both of our eyes. So thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Poetry of Predicament.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.